Uh, Ladies and gentlemen, like Nick, I guess I feel like I'm a little pretender here, and normally I like to do a lot of hand waving and walking around whilst talking, but I'll stay true to David's paper, which I distilled to this presentation, the seminar presentation that I'll deliver to you now. The weapon of artillery is the projectile. The effect at a target depends on the rate of fire, the total number of rounds, the type of round, and the timing of their detonation. During the war, factors influencing ammunition improvements included a peer enemy, deep entrenchment, concrete bunkers, barbed wire, defence in great depth, the climatic conditions, industrialisation, trained manpower, its availability, costs, and shortage of essential materials. Now, as was said earlier, the Australian artillery in general adopted the methods, tactics, techniques, technologies, armaments and organisations of the British Army throughout the First World War. Now, what did we know going into the war in 1914? What lessons had been learnt? Well, the employment of the British Army as a policeman to safeguard the Empire caused those lessons from some earlier wars not to be entirely embraced. The enemy was still imagined as a poorly armed and equipped tribesman, so the Empire wasn't well prepared for mobilisation. There were other factors as well. The British government, army and heavy industry were not prepared for a long continental war against a first-class European power. The research and industrial base and capacity for the manufacture of armaments was limited and certainly not ready for expansion. There was also this general belief that the war would be over by Christmas. The industrial base. The research department at the Royal Arsenal at Woolwich, established in 1907, had prime responsibility for technical design of gun and ammunition systems. The organisations that had developed the specialist skills for ammunition manufacture were the Royal Arsenal, the Royal Gunpowder Factory, Vickers, Elswick Ordnance Company and Coventry Ordnance Works. The United Kingdom had a strong industrial base in 1914, while it concentrated on some gun and ammunition making for the Army. The primary focus was warship construction and the associated guns, ammunitions and mountings. The Royal Artillery went to war with limited ammunition holdings and little in reserve, as shown here. In the first year of the war, shortages of ammunition at the front became publicly and politically known as the Shell Scandal. It was not until the government created a Ministry of Munitions under the leadership of Lloyd George and fully mobilised industry to produce ammunition in a wide range of private engineering firms, the major armament companies, and built new Royal Ordnance factories that the scandal was brought to an end. By then, the war was into its second year. It took time for the government and industry to gear up for the increase in production of ammunition to fight this industrial scale war. By war's end, there were 12 national filling factories, 4 projectile factories and 2 explosive factories. This was a huge increase considering there were only 3 Royal Ordnance factories in 1914. The nature of targets and lessons. Major issues quickly became apparent during the war. There was insufficient gun and howitzer ammunition available, and stocks, including reserves, ultimately were severely rationed. Shrapnel was perfectly satisfactory for targets in the open, but largely useless against fortifications and earthworks. Adjustment of optimum height of burst with powder burning time fuses required considerable training to achieve a satisfactory result. With the entrenchment of the enemy and barbed wire entanglements, shrapnel was only partially successful. It soon proved that beyond a range of 2,000 yards, Shrapnel was of limited use in wire cutting. The shortage of HE-filled shells was a great restriction. It was mostly provided for howitzers to be used in plunging for fire situations. So what were the ammunition improvements in a little bit of detail? As the war progressed, results in the field disclosed a number of problems. For example, information in the range tables compared with the fall of shot was found severely wanting. There was a high incidence of ammunition malfunctions. The Research Department at the Royal Arsenal, in conjunction with the Ordnance Committee, started research programs into metallurgy, high explosive performance, propellants and fuses. As part of this examination, specialised projectiles were designed. This work brought a range of carrier shells into service, notably screening base ejection smoke, parachute flares, star shells, incendiary, and later chemical gas white phosphorus shells. Some of the improvements caused additional difficulties as a result of research being rushed. For example, the interaction between different metals and chemicals used reacted, which caused premature explosives. The filling of gas shells and leakage of the liquid or reaction with the steel shells, and safety problems with the new fuses appeared. Looking at projectile metallurgy, various grades of steel and cast iron were tried due to shortages of high-grade steel, but many experimental types failed proof. Contractors were often unable to produce a finished product to the high specifications laid down, not only for ballistic performance or gauge in the bore, but to function correctly. Exterior ballistics, the projectile shape. The pointiness is measured by calibre radius head. Research was carried out to determine the best CRH, which at the time was almost universally 2 in British service. The 18-pounder gun CRH remained at 2 for the duration of the war and did not change until afterwards, whereas that of the 4.5-inch howitzer, it was increased from 3 to 8. Streamlining. Experiments in streamlining the projectile by tapering the base below the driving band were carried out, along with variations to the driving band to improve ballistic performance. However, most projectiles remained unstreamlined for the duration of the war. Wire cutting, an enormous subject in its own right. A shell filled with HE was produced and brought into service in September 1914 in limited quantities, and despite the elevation limitation of the 18-pounder carriage, proved to be reasonably successful for wire cutting and use against entrenchments. Fuses, another enormous subject in its own right. Fuse action at the target is critical to the effect of the projectile. For example, too much delay and a shell will penetrate the earth slightly before exploding with little effect on wire. There was considerable effort on improving fuses throughout the war with mixed success. The field artillery made extensive use of powder-burning time and percussion fuses. These fuses were notorious for varying the height of burst due to climatic conditions and were not always reliable. However, improvements did occur. The introduction of the fuse percussion, DA number 106, in early 1917 was a breakthrough, as it was a very sensitive direct action fuse. Some 51 marks of the fuse were contemplated or adopted during the war. A composite arrangement of fuses to obtain a time burst with HE shell was introduced by modifying the fuse DA number 44 and combining it with the fuse time and percussion number 80. Turning to propellant development. Modified cordite was introduced into British service in 1901 and remained the principal gun propellant throughout the war. However, due to the shortage of acetone, other propellants such as NCT, NCZ and RDB were introduced during the war as emergency powders. On the explosives front, the safer amatol explosive, a mixture of ammonium nitrate and TNT, was introduced in 1915 to replace lyddite. This was followed by baratol, where the ammonium nitrate is replaced by barium nitrate. TNT was only able to be brought into service slowly because of the difficulties with its detonation. The Australian experience in manufacturing munitions. The Australian government spent considerable effort convincing the British that it could establish its own munitions industry. They volunteered to produce empty field gun shell bodies and sought the drawings and specifications. By June 1916, there was little produced, as is shown here. As an epilogue, the numbers are worth contemplating and I think align with some of the things that were said earlier. The ammunition expenditure by the British Empire artilleries on the Western Front from start to finish was enormous and required the various governments involved to mobilise their respective dominions in every possible way: industry, transport, storage, control of materials, manpower, and the list goes on. Whilst additional guns were brought into service, only limited changes to basic ammunition design was introduced during the war. Otherwise, production lines, inspection and gauges would have had to have been changed, which was difficult to do. There was a shortage of machine tools, gauges and inspectors in the new factories, and it was not until 1917 that many of these deficiencies started to be seriously corrected. So what do we conclude from this quick jolly across the immense field of ammunition? The driving issue was the question of target effect and how it could be improved. At war's outset, the artillery gun and ammunition systems were not well matched to prolonged industrial scale continental war, especially the size of the artillery arm and its sustainment. A balance was managed between, on one hand, engaging targets with greater and greater quantities of ammunition, using the guns and round systems available at the outset of the war, and on the other hand, developing improved rounds, including the fuses, to increase target effect. Increasing the industrial and technological capacity for artillery production was an enormous task in its own right. Planners were at least working with proven systems, and more rounds on targets had a reasonably predictable effect. Adjusting the relative proportions of production of HE and shrapnel rounds was also able to be achieved to align with evolving fire planning methods. There were uncertainties in the development of new gun and ammunition systems. The risks and costs of failure were high. The expert technical and manufacturing workforce was small and could not be grown rapidly. Whilst new research and design did take place during the war, little came of it, and the results of the work were not considered until the war was over. It has been established that the design of field branch artillery ammunition manufactured during the war by the industries of the British Empire did not change very much. Certainly, chemical and shell fuses were introduced. In a most general sense, it might be concluded that the major effort in meeting artillery ammunition requirements was for quantity over quality. Thank you.